Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the CBD Secretariat, I would like to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar related to Agenda Item 5 of the SBI. Agenda Item 5 is on the Post-2020 framework. As you will know, if you joined us last Thursday, this is part of a series of kickoff webinars for 2022 in the lead up to the resumed sessions of the working group, SBI and Substa. I'm Jyoti Mathur Philip, and I am the Director for Implementation Support at the Secretariat, and I'm also leading the work on the Post-2020 as well as on the SBI program of work. Thank you for joining us today. As we had mentioned in the notification 2021/8085, on the resumed sessions of the 24th meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice, Substa 24, the third meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation, SBI-3, and the third meeting of the open-ended working group on post-2020 global biodiversity framework, working group 2023, the resumed meetings are now scheduled to take place from 13th to 29th of March 2022 in Geneva. In addition, as mentioned in notification 2022-001, issued on 7th January, in collaboration with the Substa Chair, the SBI Chair, and the Working Group 2020 co-chairs, as well as partner organizations, the Secretariat has been asked to host webinars to update parties and stakeholders on new documents related to the Geneva meetings, as well as the organization of work and other meeting-related aspects as needed. More information can be found under the web link shown on the screen, and I'm not going to read out the web link, but it ends with pre-Geneva 2020 webinars, which is also referenced in that notification and on the slide you see, which we will share with everyone. We will continue to update the website as dates are confirmed for upcoming webinars to be held in the lead up to the meetings in Geneva. Today, I would like to welcome you to the second webinar in this series, which will focus on the draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action and associated information documents under SBI Agenda Item 5. These documents have been prepared following the virtual formal meeting of SBI, which came to a close in mid-June 2021. Without further ado, I would now like to hand over to Charlotta, the SBI Chair, to open this webinar and provide further context for today's session. Thank you so much for joining, and now I hand over to Charlotta. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. Welcome, colleagues. I hope the year is starting off well for you. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Charlotta Sörqvist, Chair of SBI-3. I also work at the Ministry of Environment in Stockholm, Sweden. So welcome very much. I'm really looking forward to the time when we can meet again, but today I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar. So in this webinar, we'll focus on the draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action and associated information documents that have been prepared under SBI Agenda Item 5. These documents are available on the conference website. Before introducing the documents, I would like to provide a brief background on the status and how they will be taken up by the resumed SBI session. As you will recall, part 1 of the third meeting of subsidiary body on implementation was held online from 16th May to 13th June 2021. During the meeting, the draft outline of Agenda Plan of Action and Agenda Item 5 was considered 28th and 29th May. In considering the item, the subsidiary body had before it a note by the Executive Secretary setting out the draft outline of a post-gender plan of action, and it was CBD/SBI/3/4/add1/rev1. Following initial exchange of views, I noted that many parties had called for more time for input on the draft outline, with some proposing the establishment of a contact group and others calling for intersessional work for that purpose. Given the limited time available at the meeting, it was put forward under document CBD/SBI/3/CRP9 entitled Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, Other Matters Related to a Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Although it was mentioned in the first footnote that further consultation be held on the Gender Plan of Action, including negotiation in the third meeting of the Working Group of a Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework for finalization by the Conference of Parties at the 15th meeting. And as many of you participated in response to this proposal, it was an extended consultation on a draft outline of Post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. It was held from 23rd June to 29th July 2021, comprising a virtual discussion and written submissions. The virtual discussion was held on 27th and 29th July 2021. Inputs from this consultation and discussion and comments made during the third meeting of a subsidiary body on implementation have informed the preparation of a draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action, which is now available as a revised addenda to a document SBI/3/4 on the meeting website. 2 information documents have also been prepared related to a draft Gender Plan of Action. As the documents were not considered by the parties at the Part 1 of the third meeting of SBI and our time for deliberation at the upcoming SBI session will be quite limited, we would like to make the most opportunity today to present the draft plan and associated information, and also hear your comments and questions. The resumed session of SBI-3 will provide an opportunity for formal consideration of a draft post-20 Gender Plan of Action. I appreciate your participation in the session today and welcome your inputs. And I would now like to hand back to the Secretariat to Tanya McGregor, Gender Program Officer at the CBD Secretariat, to introduce the draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action and associated information documents. So Tanya, I hand over back to you.
Thanks very much, Charlotta. Thanks for opening the session. Also Jyoti. And greetings, colleagues. We're very happy to have so many of you joining us for today's webinar. And as has been mentioned, I will be introducing the draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action and the associated information documents. And I have some colleagues from other institutions here today who will be participating in presenting this discussion. The presentation will be in 3 parts. I will start by giving an overview of the draft Plan of Action and Information Document 41 on linkages with the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Next, Verona Calantes-Labale, who is an intergovernmental specialist with UN Women, will speak about opportunities under the draft plan to ensure coherence with and implementation of related commitments taken on board by the international community in different fora. Lastly, Laura Cooper-Hall, who is Gender Program Officer with IUCN, will speak about Information Document 42, developing and measuring a gender-responsive post-2020 biodiversity framework. We will respond to all questions after the third presentation. So please be sure to write your questions in the question box, which you can find on the control panel, which should be visible on the right corner of your screen. Questions will not be visible to all participants, but will be read aloud. There will be also an opportunity later in the session, once we begin the question and answer period, there'll be an opportunity to raise your hand to provide an intervention. So you will also be able to take the floor to do that. And with that, I would like to begin with the first part of this presentation on the draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. So I think we can move to the first slide. Thank you. So this is I just wanted to start with a bit of a background for those of you who may not be as familiar with the origin, the development of the draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. At the last Conference of the Parties, which was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, at the end of 2018, there was a request for the Executive Secretary to review implementation of the 2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action. So that review was undertaken and is available in the document shown on the screen in this slide. Among the findings of this review, it highlighted that the value of the post-2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action as a policy and advocacy tool, and indicated that a new plan should be developed in a participatory and consultative manner. On this basis, and taking into account the extended time frame before the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, the Secretariat initiated a consultation on the development of a new draft Gender Plan of Action for the post-2020 period. So a draft outline was prepared for a first consultation, and this was held from the 4th to 31st of August 2020. A second consultation and an updated draft outline was held from the 2nd to 22nd of March 2021. And a revised draft outline of the post-2020 Gender Plan of Action was subsequently developed, drawing on the updated zero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It was issued for consideration by the subsidiary body on implementation during the virtual formal session of its third meeting under Agenda Item 5 concerning the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The SBI decided to defer consideration of the draft recommendation on this topic, as noted in CRP 9, in order to allow an additional period of consultation. This extended consultation, which was held from 23rd June to 29 July 2021, comprised a virtual discussion and written submissions on the draft outline. The aim of the two-part virtual discussion was to obtain views on the purpose of the plan and linkages with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as views on the proposed expected outcomes and associated objectives, and views on the actions proposed, including associated deliverables, timelines, and responsible actors. Among the general inputs received were things like proposals for more gender-inclusive language in the plan, a strengthened human rights perspective. There was also the view expressed that the Gender Plan of Action should be closely aligned with the 3 objectives of the Convention. And there was a proposal for clarification of terminology through inclusion of a glossary. So based on these and other inputs received during the discussion and through the written submissions, a draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action was prepared in alignment with the first draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is the document that is available now for consideration for SBI, the resume session of SBI-3. So I wanted to walk you through a bit of the structure of the plan. Generally speaking, there are about 8 components of the plan. The first is the purpose of the plan, which is outlined as to support and advance the gender responsive implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. The plan is also intended to support a gender responsive approach to applying implementation mechanisms associated with the framework. There are a series of 5 modalities, which were previously put forward as principles intended to guide implementation of the Gender Plan of Action. So these include maximizing synergies between gender equality, biodiversity, climate change, and land degradation, ensuring coherence and coordination with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, applying a human rights-based approach to advancing gender equality in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and the fair and equitable sharing of genetic resources, addressing the diversity of all of those who identify as women and girls and the intersecting ways in which gender inequalities may be amplified for all genders. And lastly, ensuring meaningful and effective engagement of women and girls from Indigenous peoples and local communities. I should say also that the plan recognizes that the term gender encompasses all of those who identify as women and girls, as boys and men, and as non-binary individuals. As we know, women and girls around the world face a disproportionate burden of costs related to biodiversity loss, as well as conservation and sustainable use, and a comparatively low receipt of benefits derived from genetic resources. As such, this plan prioritizes the needs and interests of all of those who identify as women and girls, with particular attention to those facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. The plan includes a set of 3 expected outcomes, along with which there are a series of associated objectives. The indicative actions and a set of possible deliverables, timelines, and actors all are defined in relation to the objectives and ultimately the outcomes that are put forward. So I will go into each of these in a bit more detail, starting with the expected outcomes of the plan. So there are 3 outcomes as mentioned. The first is that all genders, in particular women and girls, have equal opportunity and capacity to contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and the fair and equitable sharing of genetic resources. So this is meant to ensure that there is equitable participation and engagement and action related to the achievement of each of the 3 objectives of the convention. Secondly, very relatedly, but also independently significant, is the need for biodiversity policy planning and programming decisions to address equally the perspectives, interests, needs, and human rights of all genders, in particular women and girls. And lastly, that enabling conditions are created to ensure gender responsive implementation of the Post-2020 framework. So these outcomes have been put forward with a view towards where we want to be by 2030 in terms of realizing the objectives of the convention in a gender responsive manner. They are also meant to position women and girls and all genders as equal actors and agents of change, rather than being labeled as vulnerable or as recipients of assistance. So I'd like to move on to speaking about expected outcome number 1. This is, again, as mentioned, looking at equal opportunity and capacity to contribute to conservation and sustainable use and equitable sharing of genetic resources. There are 5 proposed objectives that have been prioritized for action in reaching this outcome. They include increasing women and girls' access to ownership and control over biological resources, namely land and waters, to support the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And as you may know, this is very closely tied to SDG 5.8, Target 5.8, which speaks to these issues. So this is something we will speak about a bit later on, but there is an effort to kind of support the implementation of international commitments in looking at the objectives that we want to achieve under this plan. The second is around ensuring equal access for women to resources, services, and technologies to support their engagement in the governance, conservation, and sustainable use of biodiversity. And this is including things such as financial services, credit, education, training, and relevant information, among other types of services. Ensuring gender equitable access and distribution of benefits from the utilization of genetic resources, Fourthly, promoting women's empowerment through access to safe, quality, and paid employment. This also involves looking at opportunities for women, entrepreneurial opportunities in biodiversity-based supply chains and sectors. This is all intended to support sustainable management and production practices in a way that is also equitable and meets gender equality objectives. And lastly, the objective is to identify and eliminate, prevent and respond to all forms of gender-based discrimination and violence related to control and ownership and access to sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. And this includes protecting women environmental human rights defenders. So move on to expected outcome 2. This is to ensure, again, that all relevant decision-making processes are equitable and inclusive and enable more sustainable and effective implementation. So there's 3 objectives that are prioritized for action here. The first is to increase opportunities and strengthen participation and leadership of women at all levels of action, engagement, and decision-making related to biodiversity. The second is to enhance meaningful and effective participation and leadership of women in processes under the convention, including through the engagement of women's groups and women delegates. And thirdly, to integrate gender equality and human rights considerations into national biodiversity strategies and action plans, MBSAPs, to ensure that there is direct avenues for implementation at the national and local levels. So moving on to expected outcome number 3, this is, again, ensuring that the means are available and accessible to enable effective gender responsive implementation. There are a set of 6 objectives put forward here that speak to some of the areas that need further development in terms of creating and ensuring an enabling environment. One of those, or the first of those listed here, is to develop national capacity to produce and use gender and biodiversity data, which includes disaggregation of data. So this is an area that is still needing quite some assistance and development in terms of ensuring that we have the information to justify and to target interventions in a way that will be able to address both gender and biodiversity objectives. This is also very related to the objective to strengthen the evidence-based understanding and analysis of gender-related impacts of implementation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And the third objective speaks to supporting access and to information and public participation, specifically around engagement of women's organizations, networks, leaders, gender experts in implementation and reporting of the Post-2020 framework. Following that, there is also an objective number 4 on ensuring coherent gender responsive implementation of the Post-2020 framework. And this is through identifying synergies and drawing on relevant experience from UN and international processes. And these include things such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the gender action plans under the Rio Conventions, the Beijing Platform for Action, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, among others. Following that, there is an objective that is focused on ensuring effective reporting on gender responsive implementation. So this is meant to ensure national reports and submissions under the convention provide information on the implementation of the gender plan of action and gender responsive implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And lastly, all of this action requires that there is adequate human and financial resources to support effective rights-based action and gender responsive implementation of the framework. And this is necessary in terms of or necessary components include tracking, reporting, resource allocations for gender initiatives, and applying gender responsive budgeting. So I'll move on to speaking about the remaining components of the plan. So there are a set of indicative actions, possible deliverables, proposed timelines, and responsible actors that are identified in the plan. So I'll just speak to these a little bit, each in part. The actions that are put forward in the plan are meant to be indicative rather than comprehensive. So there is a recognition that the areas that are proposed for action are those where particular attention is needed, but it also recognizes that other actions may be required both to complement and further define the efforts to achieve the associated objectives at national as well as regional and international levels. So the types of actions that are included in the plan include things like capacity and knowledge development, preparing and applying guidance, as well as relevant recommendations, fostering engagement, and facilitating and strengthening financing opportunities. So a set of deliverables are included that are proposed to support the measurability of the plan. And these are meant to be more specific benchmarks, if you will, but things such as webinars, targeted training, production of knowledge products and reports, assessments, establishing initiatives and programs, the compilation of baseline data, collection of case studies, and undertaking of inclusive consultations, among other types of deliverables. There are a set of timelines, again, much proposed. I'm sorry, I'm hearing the back, I'm not sure where it's coming from. I'm hoping it's not interfering on other people's screens. So just to come back to proposed timelines, they're just set up in a stepwise process to reach towards reaching the achievement of these outcomes by 2030. And lastly, there are responsible actors listed, which include, among others, parties, stakeholders, and the Secretariat. So I just want to note here that in the last versions of the Gender Plan of Action, for those of you who may be aware of those, the focus was mainly on activities by the Secretariat, and the 2015-2020 plan included some proposed objectives for parties. This plan of action is very much oriented towards actions that can be undertaken by parties, as well as stakeholders in the international sphere and the national sphere and regional levels, and other partners, and with the Secretariat playing a supporting role. So it's really meant to ensure there's an inclusive process of engagement and participation in the implementation of the plan. So we'll just go on to the next slide from here, which is talking about the recommendations. These are included in the document, the official document, which contains the draft plan of action. So there are a number of different recommendations put forward. The first and the most important, I think, is for the adoption of the post-2020 gender plan of action. And this would be by the 15th meeting of the COP, which is intended to take place later this year. Other corresponding elements include ensuring that there is support and or that there's actions undertaken to support and advance gender responsive implementation of the framework, that steps are incorporated to implement the gender plan in MBSAPs, or steps are incorporated in MBSAPs for implementation, and that gender specific indicators are included in national indicators. Also, that national reporting includes reporting on the gender plan of action and gender responsive implementation. And there is a proposal that parties could appoint and support a national gender and biodiversity focal point. The recommendations include a proposal for a midterm review of the gender plan of action to ensure that it is on track for achieving the objectives of set forward by the 2030 date. And there's an invitation also for technical and financial support, as well as capacity building from the GEF and other partners. and invitations for contributions to establish a women's delegate fund. So this, that is a short overview of what's contained in the official document on the Gender Plan of Action. From here, I just wanted to speak briefly about the information document 41 on highlighting linkages with the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the document link is provided in the slide. So this includes, this document includes a number of different elements which are meant to support the thinking and understanding of implementation of the Gender Plan of Action. So this includes a rationale, which is established on, outlines some of the relationship between gender equality and achieving the 3 themes of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the first of which, as you know, is reducing threats to biodiversity. So there is some information talking about how, for example, land ownership and rights for women in law and practice enables women to have more substantive engagement in decision-making processes and strengthens their capacity and incentive to invest in sustainable practices. In respect to meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, the emphasis is put on ensuring that benefits for all, the idea of ensuring benefits for all includes measures to address gender imbalances in respect to employment opportunities related to biodiversity, in particular, recognizing that such action can also strengthen biodiversity outcomes. And lastly, in respect to tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming, the point is made that women are underrepresented in decision-making processes related to biodiversity at all levels, and that that participation may be considered both a fundamental right, but also there is evidence that that shows that diversity in decision-making leads to stronger outcomes, and stronger outcomes for resource conservation and sustainable use, among others. So in addition to the rationale, the information document includes an indicative mapping against the Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is a table which sets out the proposed objectives of the Gender Plan of Action and maps those against the goals and targets of the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And it's meant to illustrate areas where there's particularly relevant gender linkages for different aspects of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is intended in itself to support implementation of national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and it's meant to be a bit of a helpful guide in that respect. It also includes linkages to the target, or to the indicators that are put forward in the framework. So indicators, again, that have some particular relevance to gender and collection of disaggregated data. The annex to the document includes a table that outlines some of the coherence with existing international commitments. So again, against each of the different gender objectives that are put forward in the plan, there is have been identified different relevant commitments from processes such as the Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Rio Convention Gender Action Plans, UNEA resolutions, Beijing Platform for Action commitments, all of these existing elements in the international sphere that contribute to and can be advanced through the action towards the different objectives put forward in the Gender Plan of Action. And lastly, responding to the input received in the virtual discussion, there is an indicative glossary included in the information note, which includes various terms that are referred to or relevant to the Gender Plan of Action. So with that, I will just emphasize again that the resume session of SBI-3 And for the UN conference, Biodiversity conference later this year, the second part, the elements that will be going forward for the Gender Plan of Action are include to consider and adopt CRP9 in Geneva in March 2022, and to adopt a decision at COP15 regarding the post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. So with that, I think I can say thank you very much. As noted earlier, your questions and comments are very welcome, and we can move to discussing those at the end of the presentations. So thank you. And from here, I would like to next introduce my colleague, Verona Calantes-Labale from UN Women, who is an intergovernmental specialist and has been very closely involved with processes under the CBD and in support of ensuring that gender is well reflected in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Verona will be speaking about the draft post-2020 Gender Plan of Action and ensuring coherence with an implementation of international commitments to achieve gender equality. And unfortunately, I think Verona is unable to put on her camera today, but should be able to take the floor and speak with us. So I will hand things over to you, Verona. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you very much for that presentation. I've been involved in the development of the CBD Gender Plan of Action, but listening to you now, I'm just really, I feel that having followed other processes, I feel like this Gender Plan of Action is really very comprehensive, and also I can see that it is an indispensable instrument really in achieving gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. SDG 5, as we know, through policies and actions to conserve biodiversity and its sustainable use. We've seen it before, but I've not the way you presented it. It really, for me, it brings all the elements of how the key elements of in integrating gender perspective, equal opportunities for leadership and decision making, effective engagement of women and girls, equal access, ownership, and control over biological resources, as well as equal access to benefits. So if you have all those components and in your outcomes and objectives, we see those really, I think, and I hope that parties to the convention will support the recommendations that you've put forward, and will adopt this Gender Plan of Action that is really, really comprehensive. Just looking at some of the other processes, and I know we can speak about why it's important to have a Gender Plan of Action. As I mentioned, it's a plan for implementation, and we don't need to articulate why it's important to advance gender equality and women's empowerment in environmental programs or conservation initiatives. I can just give a few examples. The IPCC land report, for example, determined with high confidence that empowering women can bring synergies and co-benefits to household, including through food security and sustainable land management. There are also studies showing that if women were afforded equal access to productive resources, their agricultural output would exceed men's by as much as 23%. So I think there are enough studies that show that justify why it's important to promote gender equality. And of course, we don't even that's even just the surface, because in general, just advancing rights of women and girls is really important goal for the United Nations. You mentioned, Tanya, that the CBD Gender Plan of Action also seeks to align with and complement the plans of action of the other Rio conventions, and that's we can see that as we all know, the other Rio conventions also had and have their gender plans of action. And I can mention some aspects of complementarity, in particular with regard to building knowledge and data, enhancing women's participation, which is very, very important. And I can say, following the climate change process, this has really, really made a big difference in the integration of gender perspectives in the process, in the UNFCCC process. And of course, capacity building. This is a continuous activity, and monitoring and reporting. But one aspect that I want to also again emphasize here, which you already alluded to, Tanya, is financing. I think a big part of implementation is financing. And as I said, I'm following the 3 Rio conventions, and I can already say that in terms of the support for gender work, I think the CBD, we see that there's more need for support for the CBD process. This is what I can say from my vantage point. I would also like to mention that this gender responsive integrated approach to addressing environmental priorities in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda is also aligned with UN systems efforts. For those of you colleagues who are following, we know that through the Secretary General's efforts, there are now more and more actions to support, to enhance coherence and realize multiple sustainable development goals together. Through the Chief Executive's Board for Coordination, for example, they've endorsed these common core principles for UN system-wide action approach to climate action. This was in 2016. And then just in 2021, a common approach to integrating biodiversity and nature-based solutions for sustainable development in UN policy and program planning and delivery. So we are, through this gender action plan, we are also contributing towards this call for the UN system to be more coherent and support each other in their work. Now, just emphasizing what I've already mentioned earlier, the effectiveness of the GPA relies on its implementation by multiple actors and stakeholders. And this goes to what Tanya mentioned earlier, of the need to broaden the implementers beyond the Secretariat, because this is an action for parties, for the UN, for our civil society partners, the private sector, and everyone. In an informal dialogue by UN Women, together with UNFWCMC in December 21, some preliminary thoughts were shared by participants to the dialogue, including the need to enhance the alignment between the post-2020 gender plan of action and the long-term strategic framework for capacity building and development. For example, there was also a suggestion to include relevant indicative actions from the gender plan of action into the capacity building framework. And finally, the full and effective engagement of women and gender responsive implementation of the NBSAPs, which Tanya mentioned is one of the recommendations being mentioned. So, and then just again emphasizing what already was mentioned by Tanya as part of its recommendations, and I could say that learning from the UNFCCC process regarding the appointment of a dedicated focal point, in your case, gender and biodiversity focal point, I think it can really be very effective for a targeted and dedicated consideration of gender perspective in the CBD process. And we've seen in the UNFCCC process how this has helped, not just in the integration of gender perspective in the global discussions intergovernmental discussions, but also in terms of implementation on the ground. So I think this is something that the CBD can learn from. Finally, just to mention that the effective implementation of the GPA will really require access to sufficient and timely means of implementation, including financial resources. So donors, for example, have the responsibility to prioritize gender considerations in their funding for biodiversity programs and initiatives. And it will help ensure the implementation of the CBD gender plan of action also at the national level, as we have seen in the gender action plan of the UNFCCC and the gender action plan of the UNCCD. Finally, I've been saying this, and the CBD Secretariat gender team, I think, should also be strengthened. Tanya is amazing. I don't know how she can do this one-person work, but really, Tanya, congratulations. And we're happy to help and work with her. But I think that if we have this ambitious gender plan of action and the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that's also supposed to be gender responsive, I think the gender team of the CBD Secretariat has to be strengthened through more people and resources to carry out their work. I'll stop there, but happy to assure you that UN Women really stands ready to support all efforts in the systematic and effective integration of a gender perspective in the CBD process, including through the Gender Action Plan. Thank you.
Thanks.
Over
Thanks
to you,
very much. Yeah, thanks, Verona. Thanks very much again for all of your support and your very kind words. Yeah, your comments and your perspectives on this in terms of looking at the gender plan in the context of other commitments and activities underway is very very helpful and instructive, and has been throughout this process. So thanks very much again. I'd like to now turn to Laura Cooper Hall, who is the Gender Program Officer with IUCN's Global Gender Office, and she will be speaking on information document 42, which is covering the development and measurement of a gender responsive post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So thanks very much for joining us today, Laura, and I will hand things over to you.
Great, thank you, Tanya. So today I'll share a brief overview, as Tanya shared, of an information note prepared by IUCN, specifically by my colleague Molly Gilligan, and in collaboration with and under contract from the Secretariat of the CBD, with generous support from the government of Sweden and additional support from the UN Environment Program. I'd like to also note that various other important collaborators, particularly governments who responded to our survey, which I'll mention in this presentation, and representatives from the CBD Women's Caucus have helped shape key issues and recommendations here as well. Before I begin, I'd like to emphasize that really the bottom line recommendation that we have, or that is comes through this information note, is that parties do have an opportunity to ensure the global biodiversity framework is gender responsive and can implement and deliver on targets through design and inclusion of specific indicators. I hope to provide clarity on this now, and I of course encourage you all to read through the information note that is posted on the webinar page. Next slide, please. So IUCN conducted a short study that culminated in this official information note. The study reviewed the proposed set of headline indicators and component indicators for the monitoring framework of the post-2020 GBF, or Global Biodiversity Framework. The information document presents an analysis and recommendations related to the headline indicators, followed by the component indicators. We also grouped goals and targets by topic, and from there provide example indicators as entry points to ensure that gender considerations are comprehensively included within the GBF. The topics relate to equitable benefit sharing, protected areas management, access to resources, including clean air and water, safety of public green spaces, biodiversity education, and decision making. The aim of the note was, at the time, to inform discussions leading up to the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, including the third meeting of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It was also to respond to the theory of change and enabling conditions that are laid out in the first draft of the GBF, and to inform development and implementation of the post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. I'll provide you all with some general information from the indicator analysis, and from there propose some considerations and food for thought regarding this analysis to further align the GBF with the Gender Plan of Action. I'd like to note that this information note was written and developed at a specific point in time, as I've mentioned, which impacts the specific versions of the monitoring framework reviewed. We feel the recommendations are still very much appropriate, but as you review the note and as I present, keep in mind that some details might have adjusted, such as targets and specific text for headline and component indicators. I'd also like to mention that, of course, in the information note, you can find tables with many more details on the goals, targets, and headline indicators and opportunities for enhancing gender responsiveness that I covered today. So let's begin with the headline indicators. As we know, the headline indicators cover the overall scope of the goals and targets. The information note does note that it is important for parties to retain the current gender-related headline indicators headline indicator through the targets, and operationalize gender entry points, specifically through Goal C, and then more detail in the note is included on Target 14 and Target 16. Goal C does focus on equitable sharing of benefits, so it's really an important goal to explore, as gender equality has a direct link to equitable sharing of benefits derived from the use of genetic resources. The components included do not cover the full range of how people and communities share benefits. So we suggested reconsidering a draft indicator under Target 13 that could be a useful tool in considering equitable benefit sharing, which you can see here on that slide, or on this slide. Now, next slide, looking at the component indicators. The component indicators are tools to monitor the goals and the targets of the GBF in complement to the headline indicators. Our first look is at the goals toward the 2050 vision for biodiversity. There were 4 long-term goals which covered overarching priorities, such as enhancing the integrity of all ecosystems using conservation and sustainable use to ensure nature's contributions are valued for the benefit of all, fairly and equitably sharing the benefits from utilizing genetic resources, and closing the gaps between available and necessary means of implementation, including financial. There are many entry points for considering the implications of how women and men may have access to, rely on, and benefit from genetic resources differently. We did recommend digging deeper to design indicators that help determine if women and men are equitably receiving these benefits from ecosystem services, and if financial resources used to enhance implementation incorporate resources for capacity building on gender equality and gender mainstreaming within biodiversity programming. Incorporating these considerations in measurement can encourage parties to prioritize gender mainstreaming within their implementation efforts. As I mentioned, we also grouped targets into topics. So the first grouping, or focusing on targets 1 through 8, focused on reducing threats on biodiversity. Within this grouping, target 4 focused on the conservation and management of genetic diversity pertaining to wild and domesticated species. This can include an indicator on protected area managers to ascertain the proportion of women and men in conservation roles. Other targets could be enhanced within this grouping by capturing gender and sex disaggregated data, looking ahead into investment and capacity for implementation enabling conditions. This could be developed and incorporated into household surveys or even household time use surveys. The second grouping, targets 9 through 13, focused on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. In meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, it is essential that the often differing needs of women and men and other identities be taken into consideration. There were many opportunities here to incorporate gender statistics, including opportunities to disaggregate indicators by sex. You can see details on specific indicators in our information note. We also included mention of how to align these indicators with the SDGs, which has come through conversation today a bit as well, noting many opportunities for cohesion across the two through these suggested indicators. A third grouping here were between targets 14 and 21, which focused on tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. Within this theme, there are entry points pertaining to tools and solutions for GBF implementation and mainstreaming. Our note includes specifics around indicators that support implementation of mainstreaming efforts and shows how indicators in this grouping can also align with SDGs, again, through indicator design. On the screen here, you can see specific examples of indicators we included in the information note, but again, many more details are included in the information note itself. So I encourage you to check that out. Next slide, please. So as outlined today, and as we know, gender equality is substantively incorporated in the GBF in several core sections, including the theory of change. The Gender Plan of Action aims to, as we've all heard today, aims to guide the gender responsiveness of and promote gender equality within and to support effective implementation of the GBF. In its objectives, the GPA draft prioritizes measuring gender-specific indicators as part of the monitoring framework to support implementation, noting that using gender-specific indicators and data disaggregated by sex in reporting on progress towards implementation of the goals and targets, and report on progress and implementation of the Gender Plan of Action as an indicative action. With this plan being developed simultaneously, a critical opportunity exists to ensure that gender indicators are included in the GBF, which can then be supported by implementation of the Gender Plan of Action in parallel. To further align the Gender Plan of Action with the GBF, there is a need to ensure that gender is considered across the goals, across the milestones and the targets, and at all levels of indicators. As I've outlined, this information document highlights gender entry points for both headline and component indicators, which could be linked to the objectives and actions of the GPA. The information note emphasizes the value of aligning the GBF with the GPA, and we hope it will help to inform development and implementation of the Post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. All right, next slide, please. So changing tacks a little bit, we also think it is worth mentioning that to complement the review and still included in the information note, IUCN, with support from and in collaboration with the Secretariat, also conducted a survey to learn more about parties' strengths or their enabling conditions and structures for gathering and analyzing and communicating their gender and biodiversity data, their challenges as well, and their different capacity needs related to monitoring gender and biodiversity. So with 87 responses from government officials from 53 countries, insights can be gleaned into parties' capacities to include gender considerations within monitoring frameworks. These findings also indicate how parties and stakeholders may be further supported to enhance capabilities to gather and use gender data to meet the priority commitments outlined by the final GBF. Some key survey results included that just over a third of respondents consider themselves very familiar with gender and biodiversity links. Just over a third consider themselves very familiar with the GPA, which we can, on either end, you could argue is a great outcome or one for improvement. We also find some reassurance as well, that parties find gender data to be relevant and useful for promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. Great to see. It's also useful for informing national and international policy making, and data is useful for reporting on progress in the achievement of the objectives of the CBD. We also found that 32 respondents indicated that their country is already collecting data on gender and the environment. They also provided examples of data initiatives at project, ministry, or national level, which was great to find. Next slide. Now, in terms of the strengths or the enablers that parties noted through the survey, they noted that gender equality policies, as well as mainstreaming gender across NBSAPs, are helpful for building knowledge and mainstreaming efforts. They also highlighted that prioritizing and creating a dedicated space for women's participation in relevant meetings and workshops and in hiring as well is helpful, as well as establishment of gender focal point systems. Finally, coordinating with women's organizations is also considered an important component of an enabling environment. That's also a great note to make here about the value of the CBD Women's Caucus as a key resource. Challenges that they mentioned include limited financial resources for data collection, issues with defining gender indicators and methodologies, and limited data collection and reporting, including on sex disaggregation. So in terms of capacity building needs, respondents indicated that more support on indicator development and methodology is needed, and more support understanding the post-2020 GBF framework itself, alongside the gender considerations within the framework and the monitoring framework. That capacity is needed, building is needed. We hope that understanding perspectives from parties on what they consider to be factors for an enabling environment for gender integration, the challenges they face for integration, and the needs they have to overcome these challenges will help support the Secretariat and others to continue conceptualizing work to further the goals of the GPA and the GPF. And the next slide. So, again, having long recognized the importance of understanding and bridging gender gaps and advancing gender responsive strategies to meet the goals of the convention, parties and stakeholders really do have a critical opportunity now to enhance gender equality and women's empowerment through implementation and monitoring of the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It's important to take advantage of this opportunity to advance gender monitoring through the entry points that we've identified or that are included in the note. The indicator recommendations provided in the document are meant to support the gender responsive goals of the GBF by ensuring that its monitoring framework comprehensively considers the gender differentiated ways in which women and men interact with and rely on and have decision-making rights over the use of genetic resources and biodiversity conservation. Along with supporting inclusion of gender indicators within the negotiations, next steps for parties include enhancing their understanding of the relationships between gender and biodiversity, strengthening their capacities to collect and analyze gender statistics relevant to biodiversity, and furthering development of relevant methodologies. As we've discussed, the GPA under development is also a tool to further strengthen implementation and monitoring of a gender responsive GBF. The GPA promotes collection and analysis of gender statistics, and we hope will benefit from the gender indicator recommendations that we did include in this note. Not only that, while some gender indicators do not yet have approved methodologies or widespread data collection, the GPA can be a tool to advance these efforts and strengthen capacity to monitor these topics. While countries may not have ready ability to disaggregate data on gender differentiated benefits, parties can design the GPA to be a vehicle through which to further study capacity gaps and invest in enabling conditions to aid in development and application of this critical information. So aligning the GBF and the GPA will support parties in advancing gender equality and women's empowerment, all together contributing toward realizing the convention's purpose and the interlinked frameworks, other interlinked frameworks such as the SDGs. So final slide, I want to thank you all very much for listening to this detailed presentation. Again, encourage you to check out the information note to read through those details. And I really would like to give a special thanks to Molly Gilligan, who led the research and the drafting of the information note, and of course to our colleagues and partners at the CBD Secretariat. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. That was a very informative and interesting presentation. With that, I think we can now move on to the question and answer segment of our discussion today. So I will read some of the questions that we've received in the question box. We'll start with those, and then if there's other questions that people want to raise through raising their hand and making an intervention, we can open the floor for that. So I'll begin, and I'll also direct any questions to my very capable colleagues as appropriate. So so the first question that we received is says, is there a reference to a sovereignty clause in the plan, because several references are not necessarily adapted to all national contexts? That's a good question, and yes, we do recognize that situations are different, contexts are different in every country, and at local levels within different countries. But as yet, there is no sovereignty clause identified in the plan. So if there is an interest to include that, that is something that may potentially be added going forward. Question 2, there is a very important difference between rights holders and stakeholders from the human rights-based perspective. Is it possible to use in the Gender Plan of Action this differentiation and mention explicitly the participation of rights holders and stakeholders backing up the rights of IPLC and women and girls to be part of the different initiatives for biodiversity conservation and the Global Biodiversity Framework implementation strategies? So thank you for that. We have kind of moved in the direction of including more language on human rights and rights-based action within the Gender Plan of Action. So again, there hasn't been any proposals specifically put forward for the using the terms of rights holders in addition to stakeholders, but that is something that could be considered if there is an interest from parties and others to do so. Moving on to the next question. It says, many thanks for an excellent presentation. You're welcome. Welcome on behalf of my colleagues as well. And the outline of a very comprehensive and strong Gender Plan of Action draft. In light of the results of the review of progress indicating that efforts of parties in mainstreaming gender equality and women's empowerment need to be strengthened, including better coordination with women's organizations and ministries, what are the mechanisms and measures or aspects of the new Gender Plan of Action draft that would ensure stronger implementation, national plans, and reporting for a truly gender responsive global biodiversity framework implementation? Would the proposed standalone target help closer alignment with the global biodiversity framework for more effective and accountable Gender Plan of Action implementation, and hence contributing to the needed implementation of reversing biodiversity loss of the global biodiversity framework? So coming back to the first part of that question, the mechanisms or measures or aspects of the new Gender Plan of Action draft that would ensure stronger implementation, national plans, and reporting for a truly responsive gender or global biodiversity framework implementation. I would say that there's quite a number of objectives that are within the Gender Plan of Action that are intended to do just that. Also, not that I can go through the whole list, but in terms of the third objective in the enabling environment, or ensuring that there are conditions in place to support effective gender responsive implementation of the global biodiversity framework, that does speak to ensuring that reporting at the national level is gender responsive, that there is engagement of women's groups and organizations in reporting and implementation processes, and thereby also supporting things like the potential development of different national plans, but there is also the objective to ensure that gender equality is integrated into national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So I think that is addressed in many different aspects of the gender plan of action. In terms of the latter point, would a proposed standalone gender target help closer alignment with the GBF? I think there is certainly potential for that to support greater attention to and implementation of the gender plan of action, as well as more specific action in respect to implementation of the global biodiversity framework. So we really need to see where the conversation goes on that going forward. I'm just moving on to the next question that we received. This is one that we received this morning as well. This is given the acknowledged importance of the empowerment of women and girls to the implementation of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, why is there no mention of sexual and reproductive health and rights, including the provision of access to voluntary human rights-based modern family planning in either the draft post-2020 gender plan of action or the information document 41 on the linkages between the gender plan of action and the global biodiversity framework? Thank you for this question. Certainly it's an important and relevant issue. I would say that no parties or accredited organizations have raised this issue so far in the discussions, and it has not been put forward on that basis. It is something that is also not directly identified within the Sustainable Development Goals or in other gender plans of action. So there is not so much of an established basis of addressing these issues in this context, but the point is noted. So thank you again for raising that. I have one question that seems to be more relevant for you, Laura. It's more of a statement, but you may want to respond to this. It says, I think that the indicators have to be evaluated by gender and not by sex. So I don't know if you want to comment briefly on that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. There's a difference between sex disaggregated and gender disaggregated or gender data. That's a helpful point. It is noted to some degree in the information note, and capturing that different type of data would be more of an overarching inclusion of the different identities that exist and how they're impacted by the varying topics that we grouped and defined in the information note. But I think that's a great point to take note of, and very valuable and very important, that differentiation.
Thanks very much, Laura. Okay, the next question is, the Gender Action Plan talks about the beneficiaries of biodiversity, but what happens with women environmental biodiversity defenders? I believe that it should be included since they are on the ground to stop the loss of biodiversity in many fronts, and that should be recognized. Just state that it is under objective 1.5 that there is a reference to the need to protect women environmental human rights defenders. So that is addressed within the current draft of the plan. The following question along somewhat similar or related lines in terms of indicators. So again, I will see if you want to answer this, Laura, but the question is, in the case of park keepers or park rangers, also political harassment should be included and a mechanism to monitor the status of women park rangers. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, Laura.
I think that's great. There are two different, The information note does not include indicators specific to park rangers or to specific, but it does link to capturing sex disaggregation in terms of the types of roles that do exist and linked to biodiversity. So there's opportunity there to get even more specific. And the topic or the inclusion of harassment, that's also something that could be not just specific to park rangers, but a type of data capturing that could really strengthen the GBF and also be included and create synergy and alignment with the GPA when thinking about gender-based violence and how that links to biodiversity. We didn't provide in the information note a lot of detail on how gender-based violence and data on collecting gender-based violence information, or the types of indicators around that could be included in the GBF, but it's definitely worthwhile and an important link, and collecting data and having that data on the link is missing and is being talked about more and more as a really relevant overlap and consideration in this area. So worthwhile to keep bringing up in conversation. We hope parties are interested in capturing that type of data and including more of that that information in the GBF and the GPA as well. And it's again an opportunity for further alignment and support across both documents. Thanks, Tanya.
Thanks very much, Laura. Thank you. I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from the IUN-CBD Women Unit of Africa IUN-CBD University Network. They had indicated that they presented an additional objective on women in education, science, and Indigenous learning systems at the CBD consultation that was held this summer, which was supported by parties, and it was added on the screen, sorry. However, this additional objective was not reported in the report of the consultations nor in the document prepared for the next CBD SBI that includes the next draft. Please maybe provide clarification on the process and modalities. I'm sorry, I'll have to get back to you on this more, as it is a very precise question, and I want to make sure I'm coming back to you with the full information on this. So we'll follow up independent of this conversation. Thank you. Okay, the next question is, thank you so much for all the great work done in presentations. Regarding the proposed timelines of the Gender Plan of Action, would it be possible to also add the starting year of the period, not just the deadline one? Well, I'm not sure if we want to be so precise in terms of indicating when exactly different activities need to be commenced. I think presumably once the Gender Plan of Action is adopted, depending on resources and opportunity, different actions, multiple actions could be undertaken at the same time. The idea with including some timelines in the document is also meant to indicate which actions may need to be undertaken on a sooner basis, so that it would provide the rationale or the kind of basis needed to undertake other types of actions. So some of that maybe could be elaborated in somewhat more detail if necessary, but I think it is not maybe always as necessary to include very precise timelines for beginning and ending different activities, but I'm open to other views and opinions on that topic. Another question here is, apologies if this has been covered already, but how will the Gender Plan of Action, be dealt with during the upcoming resume session of SBI-3? Will it be negotiated by parties? So that is a good question. Thank you for raising it. The as this plan of action has not been, or this draft has not been reviewed by parties as yet, there will be an opportunity to do so, and will be open for discussion at SBI-3. So this session today is just meant to provide an introduction for that upcoming discussion. So there will be some opportunity to consider the document in more detail at SBI-3. The next question is, we're lucky we have so many questions today. This is great. The Gender Plan of Action proposes a separate participation fund to support women's delegates. Would a better outcome not be to support greater gender balance in the existing participation funds? Is that something that could be feasible in terms of the existing funds? I think this is a good question, and I think it's a matter of it would involve perhaps revisiting the terms for the existing voluntary fund to add or have a further requirement or some form of rationale to include a greater gender balance or a greater emphasis on women's delegates, I would say. I think there is an emphasis within the fund to include a gender balance, but not necessarily beyond that to support additional women participants. So I think there is some potential to look at the conditions in the existing fund. But thank you for that. Okay, there's a small question about row 27 in terms of whether or not Gender Equality Coalition Forum refers to the UN Women Generation Equality Forum. I think it is the latter, but yeah, we'll just take another look at that to confirm. Next question is, the GPA, the Gender Plan of Action decision wording, is proposed under the Global Biodiversity Framework agenda item at SBI-3. Is the Gender Plan of Action intended to be adopted under the broader Global Biodiversity Framework agenda at COP15, or will this be made a standalone agenda item at COP15? My understanding so far is that the Gender Plan of Action would be adopted under the existing sort of package of plans and strategies as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, so under that agenda item. But perhaps if there's any further consideration of that could change, but that is my understanding for now. The next question, and I think possibly the last on our list so far, is on behalf of the Women's Caucus, we would like to thank the SCBD, the Secretariat, in particular Titania, for putting together this comprehensive draft Gender Plan of Action. Thank you. We are happy to see some of our recommendations reflected in the Gender Plan of Action. Thanking Laura, Kate, and IUCN team for also taking our reflections on board in the initial review of gender indicators. My question is that the Gender Plan of Action is good, but how do we link it to the Global Biodiversity Framework through including the monitoring framework? Without the Global Biodiversity Framework elements interlinked with gender considerations throughout. In the earlier version, the objectives of the Gender Plan of Action was was good to be linked within itself instead of all of it now being in the information documents. So I'm not so sure what the question is there, but I believe Tina has her hand raised, and she was the one that proposed this question. So I think we can give the floor to Tina from the CBD Women's Caucus to elaborate on this question and make any other comments. I think Tina maybe has the floor now. Oh, I think, sorry, I just see that there's some challenge opening the microphone.
Hi.
Okay, good. Hi, Tina.
Everybody.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Sorry, the flight path. Charlotta, good to see everybody. Tanya, Laura, virtually, this is great. I'm really happy that the Gender Plan of Action is finally here for discussion. And also thanking Tanya, I can't thank you enough. This has been a work of over, I think, 2 years, 3 submissions, consultations, extended consultations, and others. So I'm really hoping that this would be something that the parties would see a very important element for the so-called good implementation of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and also be taken together at the COP decision at COP 15. Considering just the initial reflections, Tanya, was that the GBF is really very comprehensive, really good. It reflects a lot of good elements, but I'm also wondering that there are also some more ambitious indicators that are, sorry, I think my mic is being delayed. Okay, I'm going to speak slowly. That the Gender Plan of Action has some elements, including human rights and defenders, which are more ambitious than some of these things being reflected, elements being reflected in the global biodiversity framework itself. Currently, the reference to gender is basically being very specific to target 21 as it stands, and that's where we are seeing how all these considerations, including the information documents and linking up with all these indicators, would actually see itself included in the monitoring framework itself, versus how those will be also being put together with the Gender Plan of Action. I'm also taking this space, Tanya, thank you for giving me this space, considering that it's really good to see a very comparatively very large number of participation. So this is also a kind of an advocacy voice there to parties and other agencies who may be joining us today to say that this is really very important, and I really hope that this time around we make sure that the global biodiversity framework does gender justice. It's about time. Like I said, it's a very crucial moment, including a lot of other international discussions around gender equality, including environment. The upcoming CSW 66 will be taking. This is a great opportunity for us at the CBD to head towards putting this plan in action with everybody's participation and contributions. So thanks, Tanya, a lot. We will be looking at these documents more closely, and hopefully, if we are able to make it to Geneva, be able to also prepare to strengthen this further or push for the other elements. So thanks a lot for giving this opportunity, for taking the floor.
No, thanks very much, Tina. It's always great to have your comments and views, and your leadership, of course, of the CBD Women's Caucus. So that's very appreciated. I'm not sure if I missed, I hope I didn't miss, if there's any outstanding question that you wanted to discuss. I think you had noted some of the how to get things in the monitoring framework. I think that's, you know, still a question of what happens in the upcoming discussions and meetings under the SBI-3 and associated Substat 24 and WG2020-3 sessions. So we will see how things move forward in those contexts. I'm not sure if we have any other requests for the floor. If there's anyone that has questions still to raise, please do so now. Otherwise, we will go ahead with closing the session, as we are reaching our targeted endpoint of an hour and a half for this session. Okay.
No more questions, Tanya?
Yeah, I think that's all.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you all. I really would like to thank you all good questions, and really interesting to see all the insight and enthusiasm of this very important item, and very good questions. And indeed, I also looking forward to hear more views and comments when we meet again, as I hope in person in Geneva quite soon in March. So thank you all for joining us for this webinar today and for the discussion. And I also look forward to seeing all of you in the future webinars in this series. So thank you and have a good day. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.